All right, let's jump right into this explainer. I want you to picture something for a second. Just imagine a man walking onto a brutal, chaotic Viking battlefield, but he is wearing absolutely no armor. None. No shield, no helmet. Sometimes he doesn't even have clothes on above the waist. He is just standing there screaming at the top of his lungs, and if you look closely at his eyes, well, it looks like he isn't fully there anymore. He bites down on the edge of his own wooden shield, literally bites it, so hard that he leaves deep teeth marks right in the wood. And when the swords and axes actually start swinging, he doesn't even seem to feel the wounds being cut into his own skin. Now, this guy isn't just scaring the enemy. Actually, scratch that. His own side. The soldiers standing right next to him are absolutely terrified of him too. The enemy soldiers who actually survived to write down what they saw described something that, in their exact words, didn't look human anymore. They made it incredibly clear that this wasn't just some brave guy fighting hard, and it wasn't just an angry man having a really bad day. It was something else entirely, just kind of walking around in a man's body. The Vikings called this type of warrior a berserker. And what actually turned an ordinary man into this unstoppable force? Well, it's a massive mystery that historians and scientists are literally still arguing over today. Let's dive into it.
So, first off, where does that name even come from? Berserker comes directly from the Old Norse language, specifically the word berserk, which translates literally to bear shirt. And yeah, some of these warriors reportedly wore actual bear skins into battle. In Norse culture, wearing the skin of the animal you wanted to embody wasn't just a fashion choice, you know? It was this deep psychological tool. It was a way of almost borrowing that animal's raw, untamed power right before stepping into the absolute chaos of combat. The ancient texts that recorded Viking history, we call them the sagas, describe these specific warriors as entering a state called berserkergang, literally going berserk.
And those sagas, they are incredibly detailed about what berserkergang actually looked like. Warriors in this state felt zero pain. Absolutely none. Wounds that would normally drop a grown man to the ground instantly didn't even slow them down. They were said to howl like wild wolves or bears, and their strength seemed to multiply way, way beyond normal human limits. But here's perhaps the most mysterious part of the whole shebang. Once the battle finally ended, many of them remembered almost nothing about what they had just done. A total blackout. It was as if someone or something else had been steering their body. And guys, this wasn't just some campfire ghost story. Multiple historical sources from entirely different regions, across different time periods, describe these exact same terrifying patterns, almost word for word.
And seeing those exact symptoms across the board forces us to completely rule out the most common, kind of lazy explanation you'll hear for this. People often try to just brush it off by saying, oh, they just got really angry. But ordinary anger cannot explain what we're looking at here. Look, you can be the angriest person on the planet, but if someone hits you with a heavy sword, your body is absolutely going to register that pain. Plus, ordinary anger doesn't cause you to completely black out and forget an entire afternoon of life or death combat. Whatever was happening to these men, it reached way down deep into chemistry and biology.
So, let's look at the science and systematically investigate the theories, starting with Theory 1. Way back in 1784, a Swedish scientist named Samuel Odman proposed that berserkers were eating a highly specific hallucinogenic mushroom called Amanita muscaria. You might know it as the fly agaric. It's that iconic bright red mushroom with the little white spots, the one you see in fairy tales and video games. This mushroom contains some really potent chemicals that can cause massive hallucinations, a totally warped sense of reality, a feeling of superhuman strength, and a total disconnect from physical pain. For over 2 centuries, this has been the go-to, most popular explanation.
But we have to contrast that popular mushroom myth with the harsh biological reality. First of all, nobody has ever found a single shred of archaeological evidence, no diaries, no preserved remains at battle sites, proving Vikings ever actually ate these mushrooms before fighting. But the bigger biological problem, Amanita muscaria doesn't just make you hallucinate. It very commonly causes severe nausea, violent vomiting, and uncontrollable physical tremors. Think about it for a second. A warrior who is violently throwing up and whose hands are shaking so badly he can't hold a hilt, he is not going to win a life-or-death sword fight. The actual biological symptoms of the mushroom basically ruin the whole theory.
Okay, so that brings us to Theory 2, which is much, much simpler. Heavy alcohol consumption. We know Vikings brewed and drank a whole lot of mead, which is a type of really strong honey wine, and getting heavily intoxicated before a battle was definitely a common tactic in many historical cultures. It lowers fear, it numbs the nerves. But again, the biology just doesn't fully track here. While a wildly drunk person might feel less fear, they are generally slower, sloppier, and physically weaker. Being hammered absolutely contradicts the explosive, superhuman physical strength and the hyper-lethal focus that's documented in all the historical sources. So alcohol might be a small piece of the puzzle, for sure, but it's definitely not the whole answer.
Now, Theory 3 is where things get really compelling.
This is the one supported by modern anthropologists like Kim Hjordar. It's the theory of the self-induced trance. The idea here is that berserkers essentially hacked their own psychology. Through intense rhythmic drumming, deep chanting, prolonged screaming, and physical triggers, like biting down on their own wooden shields, they pushed their minds to an absolute psychological breaking point right before the battle began. It's kind of like a highly extreme, life-or-death version of what modern high-risk athletes do today to psych themselves up before a dangerous climb or a major fight.
So, you might be wondering, is this just some uniquely Viking magic trick? Actually, no. And that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating. Anthropologists have found that completely separate, isolated warrior cultures all over the globe, throughout completely different periods of history, independently discovered this exact same trance state. They had absolutely zero contact with the Vikings, yet they found the exact same psychological door. This tells us that the berserker state isn't a myth, and it isn't uniquely Norse. It's a very real, repeatable capability built right into human biology.
Which leads us perfectly into Theory 4, the explanation backed by modern science and researchers like Stanford psychologist Robert Sapolsky. The answer? Adrenaline. Adrenaline is your body's automatic fight-or-flight chemical. It's essentially a survival hormone that gets dumped into your system under conditions of extreme, life-threatening stress. And here's the thing. Massive adrenaline dumps perfectly explain every single one of the saga descriptions without needing to rely on any supernatural elements or magical fairy tale mushrooms whatsoever.
Let's actually look at how this builds biologically, because the chain reaction in the human body is just incredible. When you get a massive adrenaline surge, your brain does a few things immediately. First, it drastically reduces pain signals, sometimes shutting them off completely. Next, it actually uncaps your muscle output. See, normally, your brain limits your physical strength so you don't tear your own tendons or destroy your joints. It's a safety mechanism. Well, adrenaline removes those safety limits entirely. You actually do become superhumanly strong for a brief, frantic window. Time feels completely distorted. And in extreme cases, your brain literally stops recording memories properly, which leads directly to that mysterious memory loss the sagas described.
So, when we look back at the history, the most likely reality isn't just one single magic bullet. It's a powerful cocktail. These warriors were likely using extreme rituals to reach a psychological breaking point. They were maybe using some alcohol to lower their initial inhibitions. And then, through years and years of intense, brutal battle experience, they learned how to completely override their biology to trigger a massive, voluntary adrenaline dump. They quite literally weaponized their own nervous systems.
Now, here's the twist.
The Icelandic legal code, an incredibly famous document known as Grágás that was recorded in the 1100s, actually made berserkergang totally illegal. The punishment for going berserk was exile. You were kicked out of the community entirely. Think about how shocking that is for a second. Why on earth would Viking society, a culture that absolutely glorified fierce warfare and hand-to-hand combat, make a law specifically banning their own most terrifying effective fighters?
Well, the crucial point here is that a warrior with absolutely no off switch broke the social order entirely. This wasn't some clean comic book superpower that you could just neatly pack away into a box after the battle was won. A man who feels no pain, loses his memory, and acts like a wild animal is extremely dangerous to his friends, his family, and his neighbors. Imagine if an argument broke out at a neighborhood feast and the rage just took over. There was no guarantee he would stop. Viking communities relied on a very fragile social trust to survive harsh, freezing winters and complex internal politics. A walking exception to the rules, a guy who could kill his own allies in a blind rage, that destroyed the trust entirely.
Which brings us to a really fascinating question. Could this happen to you? Have you ever felt a tiny micro version of this in your own life? Think about a moment of sudden extreme conflict. Or maybe a time you had to violently swerve your car out of nowhere to avoid a horrible accident. In that split second, did a strangely calm or incredibly loud, hyper-focused version of you suddenly grab the steering wheel and take over the controls?
I mean, we've all heard the verified modern-day stories, right? A parent suddenly finding the unbelievable physical strength to lift a tremendously heavy car off a trapped child in an emergency. That isn't a myth. That happens. When we compare the ancient warrior on a bloody Viking battlefield to that modern parent in a life-or-death crisis, we are looking at the exact same chemical system at work. The only real difference is that the Vikings spent a lifetime training to pull that trigger on purpose.
The berserker's terrifying power was never magic. It was a biological switch. And the most incredible, mind-blowing part of this whole explanation
is realizing that this exact same switch is still sitting quietly inside your own nervous system right now. It is hardwired into you, just waiting for an emergency large enough to wake it up.